Detroit, a city that forgot how to die. We try to bury our history in concrete and steel. We pave over the rust, but rust never sleeps. And neither do the secrets hidden beneath it. Some assembly lines never really stopped working. They just changed the product. Detective Marcus Thorne wore his badge like a tailored suit made of lead. It looked sharp and commanding from a distance, but the lining was tearing his shoulders apart. He was only 34, but the suffocating weight of his hidden life made him feel twice that age. He was a man drowning in a city that had already sunk. Driving through the flooded streets of Detroit, he felt the familiar, crushing pressure of his illegal gambling debts dictating his every move. His life was in foreclosure, heavily mortgaged to underground bosses who held his leash tighter with every passing day. Every raindrop hitting the windshield sounded like a ticking clock, a relentless reminder of the money he owed, the favors he had promised, and the soul he had steadily pawned away. The cheap plastic burner phone vibrated violently against his thigh. It wasn't police dispatch. It was the shadow world calling to collect. The men who owned his debt didn't take payment in installments, nor did they care about his badge. If he didn't deliver the inside information they demanded by midnight, they would collect their dues in broken bones and spilled blood. He stared at the glowing green screen, feeling the sickening hypocrisy of his entire existence. He was a sworn officer of the law, supposed to be hunting down the monsters that plagued the city, yet he was actively running errands for them just to keep himself breathing. The toxic green light from the screen washed over his face, making him look like a corpse that just hadn't realized it was dead yet. Marcus stepped out into the freezing deluge, slamming the door on his personal demons to face the city's literal ones. He ducked under the fluttering yellow crime scene tape, pushing past the shivering patrol officers. The abandoned Morris auto plant loomed above him, a decaying cathedral of American industry, ready to reveal its sins. He looked down at the excavation site, and the breath caught in his throat. These weren't bodies dumped in a panic. They were filed, skulls perfectly aligned with skulls, femurs stacked neatly next to femurs. It wasn't a mass grave. It was an inventory ledger made of human calcium. The pathological, terrifying need for order struck Marcus instantly. It reminded him entirely, too much, of the ruthless, cold accounting of the loan sharks holding his life hostage. A debt must be categorized, managed, and exacted with absolute precision. The killer didn't just murder these missing people from the 80s. He processed them. He treated them like defective materials on a massive factory line, stripping them of their humanity, their identities, and their futures to satisfy a twisted, industrial quota of death. The old-timers at the precinct used to call these underground tunnels the mechanical veins of Detroit. But veins are meant to carry lifeblood. These tunnels carried spare parts. Human parts. Marcus followed the faint trail of disturbed dust, leaving the chaotic noise and glaring floodlights of the exterior crime scene far behind. The silence down here was incredibly heavy, physically pressing against his eardrums. He walked past massive, rusted machines that looked like sleeping iron beasts waiting to be fed. The damp air smelled heavily of oxidized metal, wet earth, and old decay. In a morbid way, he felt a deep kinship with this ruined, desolate place. He was completely hollowed out inside, just like this building, operating entirely on toxic fumes, hidden vices, and borrowed time. The flashlight beam abruptly stopped moving. There, resting perfectly in the center of a corroded conveyor belt, was a fresh, surgically clean cut of flesh, a pale human hand. The 30-year hiatus was officially over. He stared intently at the pale, fresh flesh, contrasting violently against the rusted iron machinery. The assembly line was moving once again. Marcus realized with a sickening clarity that, much like his own deeply hidden financial ledgers, this killer's grisly work demanded continuous, unending payment. The dozens of old skeletons buried in the walls were merely the down payment of a psychopath. The horrific interest was now compounding, and the city of Detroit was about to bleed profusely to balance these dark books. A cold dread pooled heavily in his stomach as the darkness of the tunnel seemed to close in around him. He was a deeply compromised cop hunting a hyper-methodical monster, and standing in this tomb, he truly wasn't sure which one of them was actually in control of the machinery. Marcus Thorne left the crime scene technicians to meticulously bag the severed hand, retreating from the suffocating depths of the old factory. The bright, sterile flashlights of the forensics team swept over the industrial decay, illuminating 30 years of uninterrupted silence and rusted iron. As he walked back toward the surface, the oppressive humidity of the underground tunnel clung to his trench coat like a second skin. He felt a profound sense of moral bankruptcy echoing off the damp concrete walls. The factory was a perfect monument to total systemic failure, a place where things that were supposed to be built were instead methodically broken down and forgotten. It mirrored his own decaying conscience entirely too well. Driving through the flooded, desolate streets of Detroit at 2 a.m. felt exactly like navigating the crushing pressure at the bottom of the ocean. Marcus gripped the worn leather of the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white as he aggressively pushed the unmarked police sedan through the storm. His burner phone vibrated again in his coat pocket, a relentless, terrifying heartbeat reminding him that his life no longer belonged to him. He owed $70,000 to men who didn't respect badges, men who viewed human limbs with the same detachment as the serial killer he was currently hunting. The line between enforcing the law and breaking it had completely dissolved into the wet pavement. The flickering neon sign of the Midnight Diner bled a sickly crimson light through the wet, fogged glass. Inside, the diner smelled strongly of burnt coffee, stale grease, and quiet desperation. It was a well-known purgatory for the hopelessly sleepless and the actively hunted. Marcus slid into the cold, cracked leather booth, the damp chill of his soaked trench coat seeping deep into his aching bones. He stared blankly down into the pitch-black reflection of his coffee mug, seeing nothing but the hollow, compromised shell of a detective staring back at him. The ambient noise of the diner, the clinking silverware, and the low hum of the refrigerator sounded like gears grinding in a machine designed to slowly crush him. The massive man sitting across the table didn't bother to remove his soaked leather jacket. "Vaughn is losing his patience, Thorne," the enforcer rasped, his voice sounding exactly like rusted iron scraping against concrete. "He bought a police detective, not a handful of empty excuses. You need to pull the Ramirez wiretap evidence from the lockup tonight. If that file is still sitting on the prosecutor's desk by tomorrow morning, Vaughn is going to start collecting his interest in physical installments. Do we have an understanding?" Marcus didn't say a word. He just listened to the metallic clink of the enforcer's spoon against the ceramic mug. He was supposed to be a hardened homicide detective tracking down a legendary, methodical psychopath, yet here he was, actively taking direct orders from a mid-level syndicate thug. The bitter irony tasted entirely like ash in his mouth. To survive this week, he had to betray the very badge he was using to investigate the factory murders. The gambling debt had completely erased his moral boundaries, leaving him trapped in a terrifying gray zone where every single choice he made only dug his grave a few inches deeper. Marcus left the diner without touching his coffee, driving straight to the rotting edge of the city limits. He needed a map to navigate the ghosts of the Morris Auto Plant, so he sought out the only man who had ever truly understood the geography of this specific hell. Arthur Pendleton had been the lead detective on the missing persons cases back in the 1980s. Pendleton had officially retired from the police force a decade ago, forced out by a combination of failing health and a total mental breakdown. But as Marcus stood in the suffocatingly narrow, nicotine-stained hallway of the cheap apartment complex, he knew the truth. Pendleton had never actually left the case. The case had simply consumed him whole. Arthur Pendleton's cramped apartment was less of a home and more of a deeply disturbed mausoleum dedicated entirely to unsolved tragedies. The air inside was impossibly heavy, thick with decades of stale tobacco smoke and the suffocating, invisible weight of absolute failure. The peeling wallpaper was barely visible behind massive corkboards covered in red string and yellowing photographs. Pendleton sat hunched over his desk like a gargoyle, his trembling fingers tracing the fading details of a 30-year-old crime scene. He looked up through the thick lenses of his glasses as Marcus entered, his eyes gleaming with the sharp, unblinking intensity of a man who had sacrificed his entire sanity to a phantom he could never catch. "You told the brass back in '88 that they weren't just random graves, Artie," Marcus said softly, his voice cutting through the thick silence of the room. He tossed the fresh forensics file onto the desk. "You said, the foreman, never wasted a part. Look at the new piece. A perfectly clean, surgical cut." He turned the machines back on. Pendleton stared blankly at the glossy photograph. His breath caught sharply in his frail chest. No, that is physically impossible, Marcus. The foreman didn't make that cut. The foreman's hands were completely crushed in an industrial hydraulic press in '92, the old man whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably as he retreated into the shadows of the room. "He has no nerve function left. He can't even hold a pen, let alone wield a surgical bone saw. He isn't doing the cutting anymore, Marcus. He's managing the floor. He's found himself an apprentice." "An apprentice," Marcus repeated, the words tasting like copper. He looked at the trembling old detective, then back to the gruesome photograph illuminated by the harsh desk lamp. "He didn't just stop killing, Artie. He transitioned into management." The concept deeply sickened him, primarily because it resonated perfectly with his own grim reality. The criminal syndicate, holding his gambling debts, operated on the exact same principle. Vaughn didn't break legs himself. He manipulated compromised cops like Marcus to do the heavy lifting. The foreman was outsourcing his horrific compulsion. Marcus turned away from the obsessive chaos of Pendleton's apartment, the heavy air thick with decades of stale tobacco and unsolved grief. He walked down the dimly lit hallway, the flickering fluorescent bulbs buzzing like dying insects above him. The dark revelation weighed heavily on his exhausted shoulders. He was no longer just hunting an aging monster from the '80s. He was hunting a fully active disciple, and before he could even begin to track this new killer, Marcus had to pay his own pound of flesh. He had a tight midnight deadline to steal critical police evidence, a desperate act of survival that would permanently strip away his remaining morality. Detroit Police Precinct 8 was practically empty at 3 in the morning, operating on a skeleton crew of exhausted desk sergeants and half-asleep dispatchers. Marcus descended the concrete stairwell into the damp, heavily fortified basement that housed the main evidence room. The space was a massive, subterranean cage made of thick chain-link fencing and reinforced steel doors. It smelled intensely of bleach, old cardboard, and the lingering residue of thousands of violent crimes. Walking down the silent, fluorescent-lit aisles, Marcus felt a crushing wave of profound hypocrisy wash over him. This entire room was explicitly designed to safely catalog the sins of the city. Yet here he was, a sworn detective, infiltrating the sanctuary to actively protect a ruthless crime boss from prosecution. Marcus smoothly bypassed the main sign-out log, slipping quietly into the narcotics holding sector. His hands moved with a practiced, shameful efficiency as he located the Ramirez wiretap file. He grabbed the thick manila envelope, hastily shoving it deep into the inner pocket of his heavy trench coat. His heart hammered violently against his ribs as he committed the ultimate betrayal. Standing alone in the cold, flickering light of the evidence cage, Marcus felt the physical weight of the stolen file pressing against his chest like a lead plate. This was the absolute point of no return. By handing this crucial wiretap over to Vaughn's enforcers, he was actively ensuring that violent criminals would remain on the streets, free to ruin countless other lives. The heavy silver badge clipped to his belt suddenly felt like a branding iron burning through his clothes. He was meticulously disassembling his own soul piece by piece, exactly like the serial killer disassembling bodies on the factory floor. They were both just operators on a deeply corrupt assembly line. Leaving the stolen file securely locked in his glove compartment, Marcus drove aggressively toward the industrial district's abandoned medical sector. The heavy rain continued to fiercely batter the windshield of his unmarked sedan, the sweeping wipers barely keeping up with the relentless downpour. Pendleton had explicitly mentioned that the foreman suffered a catastrophic crush injury to his hands in 1992. If a master killer had suddenly lost his primary tools, he would have desperately needed extensive medical rehabilitation. Marcus pulled the car up to the rotting chain-link gates of the defunct St. Jude Industrial Clinic, a brutalist concrete structure that had once served the massive factory workforce before the spectacular economic collapse of the entire region. Marcus kicked open the rusted side door of the abandoned clinic, sweeping his powerful flashlight across the desolate, ruined lobby. The interior was a deeply unsettling graveyard of mid-century medical equipment. Shattered glass from broken medicine cabinets crunched loudly beneath his wet leather shoes. Water dripped ominously from the rotting ceiling tiles, pooling on the cracked linoleum floor. The overwhelming scent of ancient antiseptic mixed heavily with the smell of black mold. He navigated through the dark, decaying corridors toward the central physical therapy wing, his mind constantly drawing grim parallels between the physical rehabilitation that once happened here and the psychological grooming of a psychopath's brand-new apprentice. Deep inside the flooded records room, Marcus violently yanked open a rusted filing cabinet marked with the year 92. His flashlight beam frantically scanned the water-damaged, heavily stained patient files. After minutes of tense searching, he aggressively pulled out a thick folder labeled with severe bilateral crush injuries, the foreman's real medical history. Marcus stared at the faded ink of the primary caretaker's signature. The physical therapist who had spent 2 isolated years rehabilitating the psychopathic foreman had a son who now worked locally as a highly trained surgical assistant. Marcus Thorne stood in the suffocating darkness of a flooded industrial alleyway, the relentless Detroit rain hammering against his trench coat. This was the agreed drop point, a miserable stretch of cracked asphalt hidden behind a rotting meatpacking plant. The air smelled foul, a nauseating mixture of stagnant water, decaying garbage, and his own profound moral rot. He clutched the stolen Ramirez wiretap tightly against his chest, feeling the manila envelope growing damp in his trembling hands. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to throw the critical evidence into the rushing gutter and walk away, but the crushing weight of his heavy gambling debt anchored him firmly to the shadows. He was about to sell his remaining soul for a temporary stay of execution. A black sedan rolled silently into the alley, its headlights completely cut. The tinted passenger window rolled down just enough to reveal a gloved hand. Marcus stepped forward through the freezing puddles, his jaw locked in silent agony. He violently shoved the stolen precinct evidence into the dark void of the car. The window immediately rolled up, and the vehicle vanished into the storm. The transaction of his corruption was complete. He stared down at his empty, trembling hands, the icy rain washing over his knuckles. The file was gone, and with it went the last fragile delusion that he was still a legitimate police officer. He had officially become an active accessory to the very organized crime syndicates he had sworn an oath to dismantle. The agonizing hypocrisy felt like a physical tumor expanding rapidly in his chest. How could he possibly track a methodical serial killer when he was systematically destroying the lives of innocent citizens through his own selfish cowardice? The blood of Vaughn's future victims was now permanently tattooed onto Marcus's badge, a stain that no amount of rain could ever wash clean. Fleeing the drop site, Marcus drove wildly through the flooded streets, desperately trying to outrun his own shadow. The tires hissed aggressively against the slick asphalt, the sweeping wipers barely managing the torrential downpour. He needed to refocus the chaotic energy tearing him apart, channeling his intense self-hatred entirely into the investigation. The faded medical file from the abandoned clinic pointed directly to Julian Vance, a highly skilled surgical assistant working the graveyard shift at Detroit Central Hospital. The foreman's original physical therapist had unknowingly raised a meticulously trained prodigy. Marcus gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles ached, navigating toward the sterile, chilling environment of the city morgue. He needed to find the man who was cutting the pieces. The sub-basement of Detroit Central Hospital was a stark, jarring contrast to the rusted, decaying nightmare of the abandoned auto plant. Here, the violence of death was sanitized, heavily bleached and carefully hidden behind pristine stainless steel doors. Marcus walked slowly down the blindingly white sterile corridor, his wet leather shoes squeaking awkwardly against the perfectly polished linoleum floor. The air was freezing, aggressively air-conditioned, and heavily laced with the sharp, clinical sting of formaldehyde and industrial disinfectants. It was an environment entirely dedicated to cold, emotionless preservation. This absolute clinical perfection was the exact opposite of the chaotic, muddy excavation site, making it the perfect hunting ground for an apprentice obsessed with flawless, anatomical precision, and undisturbed routine. Marcus bypassed the sleeping security guard at the front desk. Slipping silently toward the restricted autopsy theater, he pressed his back flat against the cold tile wall, carefully peering through the small, reinforced rectangular window of the heavy swinging metal door. Inside, a solitary figure in pristine blue medical scrubs stood hunched over a stainless steel examination table, illuminated heavily by the harsh, concentrated glare of a surgical halo light. Julian Vance moved with an eerie, hypnotic grace that immediately sent a deep, freezing chill down Marcus's spine. The young surgical assistant wasn't just cleaning the surgical instruments, he was reverently polishing them. Julian held a heavy, motorized bone saw up to the harsh light, his eyes completely dead and devoid of any recognizable human empathy. He was meticulously inspecting the serrated blade for microscopic imperfections. Marcus watched the obsessive, rhythmic motion of Julian's hands, realizing with horrifying clarity that this wasn't standard medical maintenance. It was a dark, religious ritual. The foreman had found a broken, impressionable mind and successfully reprogrammed it to view human flesh merely as defective raw material waiting to be aggressively recycled. Pushing the heavy metal door open, Marcus stepped boldly into the blinding, sterile light of the autopsy theater. His hand rested firmly on the cold, reassuring grip of his service weapon, holstered at his hip. Julian Vance slowly turned his head, the motorized bone saw still humming violently in his gloved grip. The young man didn't flinch or show a single ounce of surprise at the sudden intrusion of a police detective. Marcus's eyes drifted past the unblinking apprentice and locked immediately onto the stainless steel table. There, resting perfectly amidst the pristine, sterile instruments, was a heavily rusted, decades-old iron gear from the Morris auto plant, a baptismal token. "You're a long way from the assembly line, Julian," Marcus said, his voice dangerously low, desperately trying to hide the slight tremor in his exhausted hands. "Your aging mentor left a terrible mess in the mud tonight." Julian simply smiled, a terrifyingly empty, calculated gesture that didn't reach his dead eyes at all. "The foreman doesn't make messes, Detective Thorne," the apprentice replied, his tone perfectly flat and polite. "He only identifies the defective parts in the system. I am simply the one who cleanly removes them so the great machine can finally run smoothly again." Marcus kept his hand resting heavily near his weapon, glaring at the calm surgical assistant. "Defective parts don't just bury themselves in the concrete walls of an abandoned auto plant for 30 years, Julian. You and your aged mentor are going to face a very public dismantling." Julian carefully set down the buzzing bone saw, his pristine gloves stained with the faintest hint of old rust. "Are we, Detective Thorne?" Julian asked, his voice a sickeningly soothing whisper echoing off the sterile tiles. "Or are we just going to quietly negotiate a mutual blind spot? Because I believe you've recently developed a tragic habit of misplacing highly sensitive police evidence." Julian reached into his pristine blue scrub pocket and slid a glossy photograph smoothly across the stainless steel autopsy table. It was a grainy, zoomed-in surveillance image of Marcus handing the stolen manila folder directly into the black sedan in the flooded alleyway just an hour ago. Marcus stared at the damning photograph, his blood turning entirely to ice in his veins. The crushing weight of his hidden gambling debt had finally intersected directly with the most prolific serial killer in the city's history. The foreman wasn't just managing a murder assembly line, he was actively managing Marcus. The psychopath had carefully monitored the lead detective assigned to his cold case, identifying the exact structural weakness in his morality. Marcus felt the sickening realization that he was no longer the apex hunter in this subterranean game. He was merely another severely compromised, defective component perfectly trapped within their grand, inescapable industrial machine. Julian casually turned his back on the armed detective, serenely resuming his meticulous cleaning of the rusted surgical instruments. Marcus stood frozen, his hand violently shaking as it fell away from his holstered weapon, completely paralyzed by the blackmail. He couldn't arrest the smiling apprentice without instantly destroying his own life and facing decades in federal prison for active syndicate corruption. The hospital's underground parking garage was a claustrophobic maze of thick concrete pillars and flickering, dying fluorescent tube lights. Marcus burst through the heavy stairwell doors, his dark trench coat violently whipping around his legs as he desperately sought the isolating sanctuary of his police vehicle. The damp, freezing air down here smelled heavily of toxic exhaust fumes and stagnant oil puddles, a jarring, dirty transition from the blinding sterility of the morgue. Every single echoing footstep sounded exactly like a heavy gavel striking a judge's wooden block, condemning him to the dark, inescapable path he had consciously chosen. The structural shadows seemed to actively reach out for him, reflecting the total collapse of his sworn oath. Marcus slammed the heavy car door shut, immediately sealing himself inside the dark, cramped cabin of the unmarked police sedan. He didn't turn the ignition key. He just sat there in the suffocating silence, listening to the relentless Detroit rain aggressively hammering against the thick concrete ceiling of the garage far above him. His panicked mind raced through 1,000 desperate scenarios, but every single exit route was firmly blocked by his own profound, undeniable corruption. He was being expertly puppeteered by a sociopathic surgeon who wielded Marcus's darkest financial secrets exactly like a precision scalpel. If he wanted to stop the brutal assembly line murders, he somehow had to completely sever his toxic ties to Vaughn's criminal syndicate. Marcus viciously twisted the ignition key, the heavy engine roaring to life with a desperate, metallic growl. He threw the police vehicle into gear and accelerated violently toward the steep exit ramp, tires aggressively screaming against the slick, painted concrete. He wasn't going back to the precinct to file a report. He was driving straight into the heavily guarded, luxurious mouth of the city's underground beast. The Velvet Room was heavily concealed beneath a derelict, historically protected theater in the heart of the decaying downtown district. It was an opulent, deeply oppressive underground casino where the city's most ruthless predators gathered to launder their dirty money and their stained consciences. Marcus forcefully pushed past the massive, bronze-plated entry doors, instantly assaulted by the suffocating haze of expensive cigar smoke and the sickly sweet aroma of spilled bourbon. The luxurious red velvet draped across the walls felt incredibly claustrophobic, closely resembling the dark, bloody interior of a freshly opened wound. This was the exact gilded cage where his massive, life-destroying gambling debt had originally been forged, a terrifying monument to his own spectacular moral failure. The low-frequency hum of live jazz music vibrated intensely through the thick Persian carpets, poorly masking the desperate, hushed whispers of broken men losing their life savings. Crystal chandeliers cast fragmented, geometric shadows directly across the green baize of the blackjack tables, fully illuminating the sharp, predatory smiles of the syndicate dealers. Walking aggressively through the crowded floor, Marcus felt the heavy, menacing stares of Vaughn's armed enforcers tracking his every single movement. The absolute, polished wealth of this hidden criminal sanctuary stood in sickening contrast to the rusted, decaying poverty of the abandoned factory. Yet both corrupt locations operated on the exact same ruthless principle, aggressively exploiting the absolute weakest parts of the dying city. Marcus forcefully pushed his way into the heavily guarded VIP lounge, violently slamming his silver badge down onto the polished mahogany table directly in front of the syndicate boss. "You actually had your men follow me to the hospital, Vaughn?" Marcus snarled, his voice trembling with a potent, explosive mixture of raw fear and suppressed anger. "You took surveillance pictures of the drop to blackmail me on an active serial murder case." Vaughn slowly lowered his heavy crystal glass of scotch, his scarred face twisting into a mask of genuine, terrifying confusion. "I don't need pictures to own you, Thorne." Vaughn leaned forward, the harsh light illuminating his ruined face. "My men didn't follow you tonight. I already got the Ramirez file. I don't care about your hospital visits, detective." The floor entirely vanished beneath Marcus's feet. Julian Vance was operating completely alone. Marcus stared at the syndicate boss, the opulent, cigar-smoke-filled casino suddenly feeling entirely devoid of oxygen. If Vaughn hadn't ordered his enforcers to photograph the illicit drop in the flooded alleyway, there was only one horrifyingly logical conclusion remaining. Julian Vance had followed him. The sociopathic surgical apprentice had actively tracked a homicide detective through the darkest, most dangerous criminal sectors of Detroit, silently documenting every single corrupted move. Marcus was officially compromised on all possible fronts, caught violently between a merciless mobster and a highly methodical serial killer. Marcus didn't wait for Vaughn's armed guards to react. He snatched his silver badge off the polished mahogany table and practically sprinted toward the heavy bronze exit doors. The crystal chandeliers above him cast fragmented, dizzying shards of light across the velvet carpets, mimicking the absolute, chaotic shattering of his entire investigation. He violently shoved past a group of drunken gamblers, bursting back out into the freezing, relentless Detroit downpour. Behind the wheel of his unmarked police sedan, Marcus felt a deep, primal panic taking permanent root in his chest. He was no longer a detective piecing together a 30-year-old cold case. He was a trapped rat navigating a maze entirely designed by a psychopathic prodigy. The overwhelming paranoia gnawed violently at his frayed nerves. Julian knew about the gambling debt. Julian knew about the stolen Ramirez wiretap. The young surgeon had perfectly diagnosed Marcus's moral decay, using it as a surgical instrument to completely paralyze the police department from the inside out. His own catastrophic personal failures had become the exact shield protecting the foreman's bloody assembly line. Operating on pure, desperate adrenaline, Marcus grabbed the cheap plastic burner phone from the passenger seat and aggressively rolled down the driver's side window. The icy wind howled violently into the dark cabin as he hurled the toxic device far out into the flooded, rain-swept street. It shattered loudly against the wet concrete, finally severing his digital leash to the underworld, though he knew the physical danger was only just beginning to accelerate. He drove recklessly back to the decaying edge of the city limits, slamming the brakes outside Arthur Pendleton's dilapidated apartment complex. The towering brick structure looked like a rotting, forgotten tombstone against the violently stormy sky. A single, flickering street lamp cast long, skeletal shadows across the flooded parking lot, creating an atmosphere of deep, oppressive dread. The heavy Detroit rain washed relentlessly down the cracked brick facade, looking entirely like black tears bleeding from the ruined architecture. Marcus knew that if Julian was actively monitoring the police investigation, the old, obsessive detective who originally chased the foreman would be the absolute first loose end the apprentice would permanently tie up. Marcus drew his heavy service weapon, kicking the rusted iron security door open with a violent crash. He sprinted aggressively up the narrow, claustrophobic concrete stairwell, taking the steep steps two at a time. His soaking wet leather shoes slapped loudly against the dark, grimy steps, his frantic breathing echoing loudly in the deeply shadowed, suffocatingly tight corridor. He reached the 4th floor, his blood turning entirely to ice. The heavy wooden door to apartment 4B was already pushed wide open, hanging loosely on bent hinges. Marcus carefully sliced the pie, sweeping his drawn weapon through the terrifyingly silent living room. The suffocating, obsessive chaos that had previously defined Pendleton's existence was completely gone. The towering stacks of yellowing case files, the chaotic corkboards heavily laced with red string, the overflowing ashtrays, everything had been meticulously, flawlessly organized. The heavy stench of stale tobacco had been entirely replaced by the sharp, stinging, unmistakable odor of industrial bleach and medical-grade disinfectants. Marcus lowered his trembling weapon, staring in absolute, horrified disbelief at the unnerving, geometric perfection of the newly arranged room. It was a psychological violation far worse than total destruction. Julian hadn't just broken into the old detective's apartment, he had completely sanitized it. He had violently imposed his twisted, psychopathic version of perfect order upon Pendleton's chaotic grief. The obsessive need to clean, to categorize, to process, it was the exact same sickening methodology used on the human bones in the factory walls. Marcus felt a profound, crushing guilt threatening to suffocate him. He had unknowingly led the clinical monster directly to the doorstep of the only man who had ever truly understood the danger. There was absolutely no sign of struggle, no sign of blood, and no sign of Arthur Pendleton. But resting perfectly in the exact center of the polished wooden desk was a single, pristine silver scalpel. Marcus slowly approached the desk, the harsh, singular beam of the warm desk lamp illuminating the terrifyingly clean surgical instrument resting on the polished wood. The utter silence of the sanitized apartment was absolutely deafening, pressing aggressively against his eardrums like the crushing pressure of deep ocean water. Every single shadow in the room felt heavily loaded with malicious intent. He turned his head slowly toward the rain-streaked living room window, looking down at the flooded street far below. Parked directly under the flickering, dying amber light of the broken street lamp was a sleek, utterly motionless black sedan. Its dark-tinted windows completely obscured the predator sitting patiently inside, calmly watching the trapped detective completely unravel. Marcus didn't hesitate. He tore away from the rain-streaked window, sprinting violently back down the claustrophobic concrete stairwell. He burst through the rusted security door, plunging entirely into the freezing Detroit downpour. His service weapon was drawn and leveled directly at the black sedan, idling ominously beneath the flickering amber street lamp. He was completely done running from his own terrible ghosts. It was finally time to put a heavy bullet directly into the criminal machine. The heavy rain lashed aggressively against Marcus's leather trench coat as he approached the idling vehicle, his soaked shoes splashing loudly through the deep puddles of the flooded street. He kept his weapon perfectly steady, expecting the sociopathic surgical apprentice to suddenly roll down the tinted window and deliver another calculated threat. But as Marcus violently yanked the driver's side door open, the crushing reality of his terrifying situation set in. The sleek black sedan was completely empty. The engine was running, the heater was blasting comfortably, but there was absolutely no one behind the wheel. Julian Vance had intentionally left the vehicle here as a psychological taunt, a massive iron monument to Marcus's profound, suffocating helplessness in the face of absolute, methodical perfection. Resting perfectly in the center of the empty leather driver's seat was a neatly rolled, pristine blue architectural blueprint. A single, fresh, bloody fingerprint was pressed deliberately onto the bottom corner, officially inviting the deeply compromised detective to the next horrific stage. Marcus stared down at the crisp blue paper illuminated by the flickering, dying street lamp. The highly detailed schematic clearly outlined the colossal, subterranean filtration tanks of the abandoned city waterworks facility. It was an incredibly massive, entirely forgotten industrial tomb located deep beneath the decaying urban grid. Julian was explicitly telling him exactly where he had taken Arthur Pendleton to be systematically processed. The overwhelming toxic guilt burned aggressively through Marcus's chest like swallowed battery acid. His own desperate, cowardly attempts to cover up his crippling syndicate gambling debts had directly provided this psychopath with the perfect, unmonitored window to abduct the only innocent man who had ever truly tried to help him. Marcus aggressively threw his unmarked police sedan into gear, his tires screaming violently against the flooded asphalt as he tore away from the apartment complex. He sped recklessly through the dark, abandoned streets of the industrial sector, pushing the heavy engine to its absolute limits. Every passing second felt exactly like a fatal drop of blood draining permanently from Pendleton's fragile veins. The abandoned city waterworks was a brutalist concrete leviathan, slowly sinking into the muddy, toxic banks of the Rouge River. Massive, heavily rusted iron pipes snaked chaotically out of the decaying brickwork, like the exposed veins of a rotting industrial giant. The relentless Detroit downpour battered the shattered glass of the towering clerestory windows, creating a deafening, rhythmic roar that completely swallowed any other sound in the desolate sector. Marcus parked his vehicle near the rusted perimeter, staring up at the overwhelming, oppressive architecture. The massive facility was originally designed to rigorously filter out the toxic impurities of the entire city, making it the perfect terrifyingly symbolic slaughterhouse for a psychopathic apprentice obsessed with forcibly cleansing the deeply defective human system. Marcus shouldered his way aggressively through the heavy, rusted metal service door, stepping cautiously into the pitch-black, cavernous interior of the main filtration hall. He drew his heavy service weapon once again, sweeping his powerful tactical flashlight rapidly across the damp, crumbling concrete walls. The suffocating, nauseating smell of stagnant water and ancient black mold instantly assaulted his burning lungs. The interior of the massive facility was an absolute sensory nightmare of deep, impenetrable shadows and echoing, violently dripping water. Marcus slowly navigated a narrow, heavily corroded metal catwalk suspended high above a series of colossal, empty concrete filtration pools. The sharp beam of his flashlight cut desperately through the incredibly thick, humid air, illuminating jagged piles of rusted industrial debris and violently overgrown vines that had successfully reclaimed the concrete over the decades. The profound, heavy silence of the dead machinery felt intensely predatory, as if the massive building itself was holding its breath in anticipation of the coming violence. His wet footsteps clanged loudly against the metal grating, completely announcing his desperate presence to whatever monster was waiting patiently below. A sudden, incredibly sharp noise echoed violently from the deepest concrete basin below. It was the distinct, rhythmic screech of a heavy surgical bone saw actively grinding against solid iron, meticulously testing the serrated blade before the actual procedure began. He stared down into the impenetrable black void of the dry filtration tank, his heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against his bruised ribs. The metallic screeching of the motorized bone saw was a deliberate, highly psychological countdown. Julian was completely in control of the terrifying tempo, expertly orchestrating the brutal dismantling of Arthur Pendleton, while actively inviting Marcus to bear helpless witness to the profound failure. To even attempt to save the old detective, Marcus would have to physically descend into the darkest, most isolated depths of the city's ruined infrastructure. It was a perfectly fitting, agonizing descent for a completely compromised cop who had already allowed his own morality to rot entirely away in the dark. Marcus descended the treacherous, rusted iron ladder into the pitch-black abyss of the empty concrete filtration tank. His wet leather shoes slipped dangerously against the corroded metal rungs, every chaotic movement echoing violently throughout the cavernous industrial tomb. He kept his heavy service weapon drawn, his tactical flashlight cutting desperately through the thick, suffocating darkness, searching frantically for the psychopathic surgical apprentice waiting below. The floor of the massive concrete basin was heavily blanketed in a thick layer of toxic, stagnant sludge and jagged industrial debris. Marcus swept his sharp flashlight beam across the terrifyingly silent expanse, the overwhelming stench of ancient decay aggressively assaulting his burning lungs. The cavernous walls stretched infinitely upward, completely trapping him within the brutalist architecture of the forgotten city. This desolate, ruined environment was the perfect, nightmarish mirror to his own deeply corrupted soul. He had allowed his profound gambling debts to entirely erode his moral foundation, and now he was physically wandering through the rotting, subterranean consequence of his own catastrophic failures, waiting for the inevitable executioner to step out from the deep, impenetrable shadows. The brilliant white beam of the flashlight violently snapped onto a terrifyingly pristine, stainless steel surgical chair positioned perfectly in the center of the muck. It was completely empty. Resting on the seat was a spinning vintage tape recorder. Staring at the sterile, horrifyingly empty chair, Marcus felt a sudden, violently disorienting wave of profound psychological vertigo. The psychopathic apprentice wasn't just setting a physical ambush. He was meticulously orchestrating a calculated psychological dissection. The cold, calculated setup instantly dragged Marcus's deeply fractured mind back to the suffocating, cigar smoke-filled back office of the Velvet Room Casino. It was the exact same feeling of absolute, paralyzing helplessness he had experienced the night Vaughn first bought his police badge. He realized with sickening clarity that Julian Vance was merely the sharp, physical scalpel. The actual disease actively destroying Marcus's life was his own inescapable cowardice and his pathetic, desperate need to hide his sins from the daylight. In the deeply repressed, nightmarish memory rapidly flooding his consciousness, Marcus was sitting aggressively cornered in the opulent, blood-red back office of the underground syndicate. The heavy, claustrophobic air was incredibly thick, with expensive bourbon and raw intimidation. A massive, leather-bound financial ledger rested heavily on the mahogany desk, explicitly detailing the $70,000 he had recklessly gambled away. He remembered the exact, agonizing moment his trembling hand signed the corrupt contract, officially trading his sacred oath for a temporary illusion of safety. The oppressive weight of that specific, damning signature now physically manifested as the crushing concrete walls of the abandoned waterworks, pressing violently inward, actively suffocating the last remaining fragments of his humanity. The harsh, mechanical click of the vintage tape recorder violently shattered the terrifying memory, snapping Marcus entirely back to the dark filtration tank. Julian's cold, sickeningly calm voice echoed aggressively through the massive concrete basin. "You look incredibly tired, Detective Thorne," the recorded voice whispered with sociopathic precision. "You have spent so much time desperately trying to balance your hidden ledgers that you completely forgot how to be a policeman." Arthur Pendleton never compromised his own assembly line. That is exactly why his parts are still valuable. Operating on a violently desperate surge of pure adrenaline, Marcus aggressively kicked the vintage tape recorder into the toxic sludge, shattering the plastic casing. He pivoted sharply, his tactical flashlight instantly illuminating a heavy, rusted iron hatch leading directly into the subterranean pump room. He violently shouldered the massive door open, throwing himself recklessly into the next terrifying stage of the psychopathic maze. The subterranean pump room was a claustrophobic, deeply terrifying cathedral of heavily rusted iron and violently pressurized water lines. Massive, corroded pipes snaked chaotically across the damp concrete ceiling, aggressively leaking freezing, toxic water onto the slippery floor below. The deafening, rhythmic roar of the active storm drain system outside vibrated intensely through the thick walls, effectively drowning out any desperate cries for help. Deep, impenetrable shadows aggressively clung to the complex industrial machinery, creating a terrifying labyrinth of jagged metal and absolute darkness. Marcus moved slowly through the suffocating environment, his heavy service weapon trembling slightly in his grip as the overwhelming, freezing atmosphere relentlessly attacked his deeply frayed nerves, pushing him closer to a total psychological collapse. The sharp flashlight beam frantically swept across the massive iron manifold, violently freezing on a terrifying scene. Arthur Pendleton was heavily bound to the rusted machinery with thick industrial zip ties, pale, bloody, but miraculously still breathing. Julian Vance stepped smoothly out of the pitch-black shadows the motorized surgical bone saw humming violently in his gloved hand. "You arrived exactly on schedule, Marcus," the young apprentice said, his dead eyes completely devoid of human emotion. "The old detective system is incredibly inefficient. It requires an aggressive, permanent pruning. But before I process him, we need to finalize our own little transaction. Drop your police weapon into the muddy water, or I will immediately sever his carotid artery." Marcus stood entirely paralyzed in the freezing, toxic sludge, his service weapon aimed directly at the smiling, sociopathic surgeon. The ultimate agonizing choice was finally laid bare before him, a brutal culmination of his massive compounding debts. If he shot the apprentice, Julian's Deadman switch would inevitably trigger the release of the damning surveillance photos to the federal authorities, permanently destroying Marcus's entire life and sending him to a violent prison. If he dropped the gun, Pendleton would be mercilessly slaughtered on the rusted assembly line right in front of his eyes. The terrifying weight of his hidden syndicate corruption had finally forged a completely inescapable trap, and there was absolutely no clean way out. His heart hammering violently against his bruised ribs, Marcus slowly, agonizingly lowered his heavy service weapon toward the dark, swirling water. The freezing rain leaked heavily through the cracked concrete ceiling, washing over his deeply defeated, completely exhausted face. He was actively surrendering the last remaining fragment of his shattered soul to the absolute darkness. The heavy splash of the service weapon, dipping slightly into the toxic sludge, echoed like a final, definitive gavel strike within the cavernous pump room. Marcus didn't raise his hands. He simply let his shoulders collapse, entirely surrendering the grand illusion that he was still a righteous officer of the law. The crushing silence that immediately followed was far more terrifying than the screech of the surgical bone saw. The freezing, heavily contaminated water leaked rhythmically from the rusted iron manifolds above, violently counting down the last remaining seconds of his deeply fractured morality. He was completely out of tactical options, completely out of legal jurisdiction, and tragically out of time. The suffocating physical darkness of the subterranean concrete tank perfectly mirrored the absolute, inescapable black hole his massive gambling debts had meticulously carved out of his own soul. Julian Vance slowly released the trigger of the heavy, motorized bone saw. The aggressive, metallic screech died away, leaving only the oppressive sound of dripping water. The young surgical apprentice smiled, an incredibly hollow, deeply calculating expression that sent a violent shiver down Marcus's spine. "You finally understand the geometry of the machine, detective," Julian whispered, his voice incredibly smooth and perfectly detached from the horrific reality of the room. "You cannot possibly arrest me without the federal authorities immediately discovering the staggering depth of your own syndicate corruption. Your badge is already completely rusted through. You are a deeply defective part, desperately trying to govern an assembly line you no longer control. Arthur Pendleton must be removed because he still believes in the archaic system you yourself abandoned for $70,000. Marcus listened to the sociopathic dissection of his entire life, the freezing water numbing his trembling legs. Julian was absolutely right. The police detective was dead. He had died the exact moment he handed that stolen wiretap over to Vaughn's enforcer. But as he stared into the cold, dead eyes of the serial killer, a terrifying, incredibly dark realization began to actively bloom in the toxic soil of his ruined mind. If he could no longer function as a legally bound cop, he would have to ruthlessly operate as the corrupted criminal he had become. "You only process defective parts, Julian," Marcus said, his voice dropping to a harsh, gravelly whisper that blended perfectly with the grim industrial decay. "Pendleton isn't defective. He's just old. But I know exactly where you can find the most structurally corrupt, fundamentally diseased component in this entire ruined city. Vaughn," Marcus stated simply, explicitly offering the incredibly powerful, ruthless syndicate boss directly to the psychopathic apprentice on a silver platter. "He fundamentally infects thousands of people. He actively corrupts the police, he aggressively poisons the neighborhoods, and he operates completely above the law you claim to clean up. Pendleton is absolutely nothing compared to him." Marcus felt the last remaining threads of his sworn oath violently snapping. He was officially weaponizing a prolific serial killer to violently assassinate a mafia boss, actively trading one horrific monster for another just to save his old mentor. It was a deeply sickening, profoundly dark moral compromise that would permanently stain his soul, but in the suffocating shadows of the ruined waterworks, it was the only brutal currency he had left to spend. Julian tilted his head slightly, like a curious predator, intensely analyzing a completely unexpected behavioral shift in its prey. The absolute, clinical perfection of his murder assembly line was deeply rooted in removing the city's hidden rot, and the incredibly wealthy, heavily protected syndicate boss was indeed the ultimate manifestation of that systemic disease. "A major structural replacement," Julian murmured softly, his dead eyes practically gleaming in the harsh flashlight beam. "You are actively offering me the primary architect of your own personal destruction, detective. It is a highly irregular deviation from the established schedule, but an incredibly fascinating upgrade to the overall machinery." The sharp, incredibly clean sound of the thick industrial zip tie actively snapping echoed through the dark room. Julian's pristine silver scalpel effortlessly severed the heavy plastic binding, The horrific deal was officially struck in the absolute darkness. Marcus lunged aggressively forward through the toxic, freezing sludge, desperately catching the frail, unconscious body of Arthur Pendleton. Just as the old man collapsed from the rusted iron manifold, the suffocating weight of the mentor he had barely managed to save pressed heavily against his chest. When Marcus violently snapped his tactical flashlight back toward the center of the dark room, the pristine blue surgical scrubs were completely gone. Julian Vance had silently vanished into the impenetrable, cavernous shadows of the waterworks, eagerly accepting the incredibly dark contract. Marcus had successfully saved Pendleton's life, but he had actively unleashed an unrestrained, highly methodical psychopath directly into the absolute highest echelons of the criminal underworld. Sitting behind the wheel of his unmarked police sedan, parked blocks away from the abandoned waterworks, Marcus listened to the harsh, rattling breath of the unconscious Pendleton lying heavily in the back seat. The relentless Detroit rain continued to violently batter the windshield, but Marcus was completely numb to the freezing cold. He stared completely blankly at the deeply flooded, neon-lit road ahead. The profound psychological cost of his survival was actively tearing his mind apart. He had officially crossed the ultimate, unforgivable line. He hadn't just compromised his badge. He had actively played the horrific role of God, explicitly deciding who would be meticulously slaughtered on the assembly line to balance his own deeply corrupt financial ledgers. Marcus drove slowly, methodically through the aggressively flooded industrial district, eventually parking his dark vehicle deep within the narrow, cobblestone alleyway located directly behind the Velvet Room Casino. He sat in the suffocating silence of the cabin, intensely watching the heavily guarded bronze back door of Vaughn's opulent hidden sanctuary. He knew with absolute, terrifying certainty that Julian Vance was already actively moving through the deep shadows, flawlessly calculating the precise anatomical angles needed to dismantle the ruthless mafia empire. Marcus had successfully orchestrated a massive, violent collision between two incredibly dangerous predators, fully realizing that whoever ultimately survived the impending slaughter in the velvet-draped rooms above would inevitably come directly for him next. The heavy, rhythmic thrum of the engine was the only thing keeping Marcus Thorne anchored to reality. He sat in the absolute, suffocating darkness of his unmarked sedan, watching the back entrance of the Velvet Room through a windshield smeared with Detroit's industrial tears. He had officially stopped being a detective and started being a dispatcher for a ghost. The moral arithmetic was simple, yet devastating. He had traded the life of a criminal kingpin for the life of a broken old man. But in the cold, clinical world of the foreman's apprentice, no transaction is ever truly balanced. Marcus felt the weight of the stolen files in his mind, a ledger of sins that no longer had a page to be written on. He was waiting for the scream that wouldn't come, the silent, surgical removal of a city's primary infection. His mind drifted back to a time when the gray zones weren't so pitch black. He remembered his first major interrogation in the sterile, windowless rooms of headquarters. He had believed then that the law was a solid, unbreakable wall. He hadn't yet realized it was merely a series of suggestions, easily bypassed by those with enough leverage or enough desperation. The flickering overhead light back then had seemed like a beacon of truth. Now it felt like the failing pulse of his own integrity. Every choice he had made since that night, every bet placed, every debt ignored, had been a slow, methodical dismantling of the man who once stood on the right side of the table. He was a product of his own assembly line, built from parts of regret, and reinforced with the steel of survival. The bronze door creaked open, just a fraction. No guards rushed out. No alarms shattered the heavy Detroit night. Instead, a single, pristine blue surgical glove floated lazily in a dark, oily puddle, its sterile color a violent insult to the surrounding filth. The silence was absolute. The apprentice had completed his rounds. Vaughn's empire, built on decades of fear and financial ruin, had been reduced to a series of defective parts, cleanly removed and filed away in the dark. Marcus didn't need to see the interior to know that the velvet drapes were now soaked in a different kind of red. The debt was settled, but the auditor was still out there, moving through the rain with a scalpel that never grew dull. Marcus shifted the car into drive, his movements slow, deliberate, and entirely hollow. He glanced once at the rearview mirror, seeing only the dark, silent shape of Arthur Pendleton in the back seat, a man he had saved, but a man who would wake up to a world that no longer made sense. Thorne was driving toward the only place left for men who have traded their souls for a few more hours of borrowed time. The city lights blurred into long, distorted streaks of neon and chrome, a dying star reflected in a gutter. He had removed the monster at the top of the food chain, but he had done it by feeding a much more efficient predator. The Rouge River moved with a heavy, sluggish intent, a liquid conveyor belt carrying the city's waste toward the indifferent sea. Marcus stood on the muddy bank, the freezing wind tearing at his soaked trench coat. Behind him, the industrial silos of Detroit stood like silent sentinels over a graveyard of abandoned dreams. He had won. Vaughn was gone. The gambling debt was a phantom now, a ledger destroyed by a surgeon's blade. But as the rain washed over his face, he realized that the foreman's apprentice hadn't just cleared his debt, he had recruited him. Marcus Thorne wasn't just a detective anymore. He was a necessary cog in a much larger, much darker machine that operated in the spaces between the law and the grave. The silver badge hit the water with a sound so quiet it was immediately swallowed by the rain. It didn't splash. It simply sank, joining the rusted gears and broken glass at the bottom of the river. Marcus Thorne watched the ripples disappear, his face an unreadable mask of cold, clinical acceptance. He was no longer a servant of the people. He was a caretaker of the ruins. The apprentice had shown him that in a city built on assembly lines, everything and everyone is eventually processed. Some are scrapped, some are recycled, and some, like Marcus, are simply repurposed to keep the line moving. Back in the blinding whiteness of the hospital's sub-basement, Julian Vance opened a new folder. He moved with the same terrifying, rhythmic grace as before, his dead eyes scanning the pages with professional satisfaction. He wasn't just a killer. He was an auditor. He had identified a defective system, found its most compromised component, and successfully integrated it into a new, more efficient workflow. The foreman's legacy was no longer buried in the walls of a ruined factory. It was walking the streets, wearing a detective's coat, and holding a gun. The assembly line was finally running at peak capacity, and the next part was already being staged for removal. In the depths of the Morris Auto plant, a single red light flickered to life on a rusted control panel, a silent signal in a dead building. The machines were quiet, but the process never truly stops. In Detroit, as in life, the only thing more certain than the rust is the inventory. The audit is complete. For now.